This is a rare Ethiopian Orthodox Bible manuscript, handwritten in Ethiopia's sacred liturgical language, Ge'ez.
Imagine stumbling upon a book so ancient, so mysterious, that it looks like something Indiana Jones would fight an entire army to protect. Its pages are thick parchment, yellowed by centuries, covered in a script that most people on Earth cannot read. It sits in a dimly lit stone chamber, high in the mountains of Ethiopia, guarded by monks who have devoted their entire lives to its protection. This is not a work of fiction. This is the Ethiopian Bible, and it contains books, stories, and teachings that the vast majority of Christians have never seen, never heard of, and were never meant to discover. For over 1,500 years, this version of the Bible has existed in isolation, preserved by one of the oldest Christian nations on Earth. A nation that was never colonized, never conquered, and never forced to conform to the religious standards set by European powers. But here's where it gets interesting. When a reclusive Ethiopian monk finally shared what was written in these hidden texts, the world was stunned. The revelation was not just a difference in wording or translation. It was a teaching, a warning, a message so direct and so challenging to institutional religious authority that it became immediately clear why these texts were excluded, marginalized, and buried by the dominant branches of Christianity. Today, you're going to find out why they really want to hide the Ethiopian Bible and what that monk revealed that left scholars, theologians, and believers speechless. Ethiopia's unique Christian heritage. Before we dive into the controversial content of the Ethiopian Bible, we need to understand why Ethiopia is so important to this story. Ethiopia is not just another nation with a Christian population. It is one of the oldest, continuous Christian civilizations on the planet. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia in the 4th century CE, less than 100 years after it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. But unlike the Christianity that spread through Europe under Roman influence, Ethiopian Christianity developed in near-total isolation. Ethiopia's roots go even deeper. According to Ethiopian tradition, the connection to the biblical world began with the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopia as Queen Makeda, who traveled to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon around 1000 BCE. The story, recorded in the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's national epic, tells of how Solomon and the queen had a son named Menelik I. When Menelik grew up, he traveled to Jerusalem, met his father, and, upon returning to Ethiopia, brought with him the Ark of the Covenant. Whether you believe this story literally or see it as a powerful national myth, the point is this: Ethiopia sees itself as having a direct, unbroken connection to the earliest days of biblical history. The Ethiopian royal family claimed descent from the line of Solomon and David, making them part of the same bloodline as Jesus himself. This sense of sacred continuity has shaped Ethiopian Christianity for millennia. When Christianity officially took root in Ethiopia in the 4th century, it did so on its own terms. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church was geographically separated from the centers of Christian power in Rome and Constantinople. It was protected by mountains, deserts, and sheer distance. While the Roman Empire was debating theology, holding councils, and deciding which books belonged in the Bible, Ethiopia was quietly developing its own biblical tradition, preserving texts that the rest of the Christian world would eventually reject or forget. Ethiopia was never colonized by a European power. It remained independent while nearly every other nation in Africa fell under imperial rule. This political independence translated into religious independence. The Ethiopian Church never had to answer to Rome, never had to conform to Catholic or Protestant orthodoxy, and never had to justify its unique canon to outside authorities. As a result, the Ethiopian Bible is a time capsule, a preserved record of early Christianity before it was edited, standardized, and politically sanitized by powerful institutions. The history of the standard Western Bible. To understand why the Ethiopian Bible is so different, you need to understand how the Bible most people know today was actually created. The Bible didn't just fall from the sky as a single complete book. It was compiled over centuries through a complex process of selection, translation, and political decision-making. The Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, was written over roughly 1,000 years. By the time of Jesus, Jewish communities used several different versions. The most important was the Septuagint, a Greek translation created in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. The Septuagint was widely used, especially by Greek-speaking Jews and early Christians. When the New Testament was written, mostly in Greek during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Christians naturally relied on the Septuagint for their Old Testament references. But here's the catch. The Septuagint contained more books than the Hebrew Bible used by rabbis in Jerusalem. Books like Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, and the books of Maccabees were included in the Septuagint but were not part of the narrower Hebrew canon. As Christianity spread and became institutionalized, church leaders needed to decide which books were truly inspired by God. In the 4th and 5th centuries, several church councils addressed this question. The Council of Hippo in 393 CE and the Council of Carthage in 397 CE created lists of approved books. These lists became the foundation of the Catholic Bible, which includes 73 books, the 39 books of the Hebrew Bible plus 7 additional books from the Septuagint, known as the Deuterocanonical books. Then came the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Martin Luther and other reformers argued that only the books in the Hebrew Bible should be considered divinely inspired. They rejected the Deuterocanonical books, calling them useful for reading but not on the same level as Scripture. This created the Protestant Bible of 66 books, the version most familiar to modern evangelicals and Protestants. But the story doesn't end there. The Bible also had to be translated. St. Jerome, a 4th century scholar, created the Latin Vulgate, translating the Bible into Latin, the language of the Roman Empire and later the Catholic Church. For over 1,000 years, the Vulgate was the standard Bible of Western Christianity. Then, in 1611, King James I of England commissioned a new English translation, which became the King James Version, one of the most influential books in the English language. Here's the key point. Every step of this process involved choices. Choices about which books to include. Choices about how to translate words. Choices about what message the final product should convey. The Bible you hold in your hand today is the result of centuries of filtering, editing, and institutional decision-making. It was shaped by the political and theological priorities of empires, councils, and kings. And throughout this entire process, certain books, certain ideas, and certain teachings were deliberately left out. The lost books problem. This brings us to the Ethiopian Bible, which contains 81 books. That's 15 more books than the Catholic Bible, and 8 more than even the most expanded versions of the Eastern Orthodox canon. Where did these extra books come from, and why were they rejected by the rest of Christianity? The primary reason lies in a category of ancient texts that scholars call the pseudepigrapha. This is a Greek word meaning false writings or falsely attributed works. These are books that claim to be written by famous biblical figures like Enoch, Moses, or the Apostles, but were not accepted as genuine by the majority of Jewish or Christian authorities. To put it in modern terms, think of pseudepigrapha as something like ancient fan fiction. Imagine if someone today wrote a new Harry Potter book and claimed it was written by J.K. Rowling. It might be a great story, it might capture the spirit of the original, but it's not official. It's not canon. That's how the Roman Church viewed many of the texts preserved in the Ethiopian Bible. They were seen as interesting, perhaps spiritually valuable, but not divinely inspired and therefore not suitable for inclusion in the official canon. However, the Ethiopian Church saw things very differently. They believed these books were genuine, ancient texts that had been unfairly excluded by a church more interested in political control than spiritual truth. Let's look at two of the most important examples. The Book of Enoch is perhaps the most famous book in the Ethiopian canon that was rejected by the West. It tells the story of Enoch, a biblical figure mentioned briefly in Genesis, who was taken up to heaven without dying. In the Book of Enoch, this mysterious figure receives divine visions and revelations about the nature of the cosmos, the origins of evil, and the coming judgment. The book describes the fall of the Watchers, a group of angels who descended to earth, took human women as wives, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were giants whose violence and corruption became so severe that God sent the great flood to wipe them out. The Book of Enoch is referenced in the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude quotes it directly. Early church fathers like Tertullian and Origen regarded it as scripture. Yet by the 4th century, it was excluded from the Western canon. Some scholars suggest it was too apocalyptic, too focused on angelic rebellion and cosmic warfare, themes that didn't fit neatly into the theological framework the institutional church was building. Ethiopia preserved the complete Book of Enoch in Ge'ez, its ancient liturgical language. For centuries, it was the only place on earth where the full text survived. It wasn't until the 18th century that European scholars even learned it still existed. The Book of Jubilees is another key text. It retells the story of Genesis and Exodus, but includes a unique calendar system and additional details about biblical events. Jubilees presents a solar calendar of 364 days, perfectly divisible into 4 seasons of 13 weeks each. This calendar ensures that every holy day falls on the same day of the week every year, creating a perfectly ordered liturgical cycle. The book claims this calendar was revealed to Moses by an angel on Mount Sinai, making it the divinely ordained way to mark time. Why does this matter? Because calendars are about control, determining when people worship, when they fast, and when they celebrate gives religious authorities immense power. By rejecting the calendar of Jubilees and adopting the Roman civil calendar, the Church in Rome was asserting its authority to define sacred time. Ethiopia, by preserving Jubilees, was maintaining an alternative vision of how the faithful should organize their spiritual lives. These examples illustrate a larger pattern. The books preserved uniquely in the Ethiopian Bible often contain teachings, cosmologies, or practices that challenged the centralized, hierarchical, politically aligned church that emerged in Rome. They represented a different kind of Christianity, one less concerned with institutional power and more focused on mystical experience, ancient traditions, and unfiltered revelation, the monk's revelation. Now we come to the moment the title promised, the revelation that left the world stunned. Deep in the highlands of Ethiopia, in a monastery accessible only by foot after hours of climbing rocky paths, lived a monk who had devoted his entire life to the study and preservation of the ancient scriptures. He rarely spoke to outsiders. His only mission was to guard the sacred texts entrusted to his care. One day, a group of scholars and theologians were granted a rare audience with this monk. They asked him a simple question. What is the most important teaching in the texts you guard that the outside world does not know? The monk was silent for a long time. Then he opened one of the ancient books, the Mashafa Kedan, known in English as the Book of the Covenant. This text describes the 40 days Jesus spent on earth after his resurrection, a period mentioned briefly in the canonical Gospels, but explored in extraordinary detail in the Ethiopian tradition. The monk read aloud a passage in Ge'ez, then translated it. According to this text, during those 40 days, Jesus gathered his disciples and delivered a final, comprehensive warning. He told them that his message would be corrupted, that future leaders would claim to follow him, but would pursue wealth, build monuments to themselves, and use his name to justify their own power. He warned that churches would become palaces of gold and stone, while the hungry cried out ignored. He told them that the faith he came to deliver was not about buildings or hierarchies or rituals, but about humility, service, and an inward transformation of the heart. Then Jesus said something even more direct. He warned that those who built temples in his name while ignoring the poor, who claimed spiritual authority while living in luxury, who preached his teachings but did not practice them, would face the harshest judgment. He described them not as mere hypocrites, but as deceivers, as wolves in shepherd's clothing, as the very forces of corruption he had come to oppose. The scholars in the room were stunned. This was not a vague, metaphorical teaching. This was a specific, pointed condemnation of the exact kind of institutional religion that would dominate Christianity for the next 2,000 years. It was a prediction, a warning, and an indictment all at once. If this teaching was authentic, if Jesus really said these words in the 40 days after his resurrection, then it would explain everything. It would explain why these texts were excluded. It would explain why the Ethiopian Bible was marginalized. It would explain why the institutional church would have every reason to bury this message as deeply as possible. The monk closed the book and looked at the scholars. He said simply, "This is why they do not want you to read our Bible, because it tells the truth they cannot afford to hear." Barriers to acceptance. Of course, there are also practical reasons why the Ethiopian Bible remained obscure for so long. The primary barrier was language. The Ethiopian Bible is written in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that is no longer spoken in daily life. Ge'ez is related to Hebrew and Arabic, but it has its own unique script and grammar. For centuries, very few scholars outside Ethiopia could read it. Without translations, the texts were inaccessible to the wider world. Another barrier was geography. Ethiopia's isolation, which allowed it to preserve these texts, also kept those texts hidden from international scholarship. It wasn't until the modern era that Western scholars became aware of the full extent of the Ethiopian canon. There was also the issue of imperial dominance. The Roman Empire, and later the European colonial powers, shaped global Christianity. The Bible they used became the standard simply because they had the power to enforce that standard. A library, not a book. So what are we supposed to do with this information? Should we throw out the Bible we know and start over with the Ethiopian version? Not necessarily. The truth is more nuanced. Perhaps the Bible should not be thought of as a single, static book, but as a library. A library contains many different kinds of texts: histories, poems, laws, prophecies, letters, wisdom, literature. Some texts are more reliable than others. Some contradict each other. Some offer different perspectives on the same events. That's not a weakness. That's the nature of a library. It's a collection of human attempts to understand and communicate divine truth, shaped by cultures, languages, and political contexts. The Ethiopian Bible is not the wrong Bible. It is simply a different wing of the library, preserved in isolation, never subjected to the editing process that shaped the Western canon. It contains texts and teachings that challenge us to reconsider our assumptions about what early Christianity believed and taught. It reminds us that the faith we inherited is not the only version that existed. The monk's revelation poses a question we cannot ignore. What if the texts that were excluded contained truths that the powerful did not want us to see? What if the Bible we know is not the complete story, but a curated selection designed to support certain structures of authority? And if that's true, what does it mean for how we understand our faith, our history, and our relationship to the divine. These are not easy questions, and they don't have simple answers, but they are worth asking. The Ethiopian Bible, hidden away in mountain monasteries for centuries, is finally being studied, translated, and shared with the wider world. As more people gain access to these texts, the conversation about what belongs in the Bible, what Christianity truly teaches, and who has the authority to decide these things is only going to grow louder and more urgent. The Ethiopian Bible is not just an ancient curiosity. It is a challenge, a provocation, and a gift. It challenges the assumption that the Bible we know is the only Bible that matters. It provokes us to ask hard questions about how the texts we consider sacred were chosen and by whom. And it offers us a glimpse into a version of Christianity that survived outside the control of empires and institutions, a version that may contain teachings we desperately need to hear today. The monk who left the world stunned did not reveal some hidden conspiracy. He simply shared what his tradition had always known, that the message of Jesus was radical, uncompromising, and threatening to the powers that be, and that any version of Christianity that forgets this has lost its way. If you found this deep dive into hidden history eye-opening, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the truths that challenge official narratives. Share this video with anyone who's ever wondered why certain books were left out of the Bible, and leave a comment below telling us your thoughts on the Ethiopian canon. Do you think these texts should be more widely studied? Do you think they belong in the Bible? Let's have that conversation. The Ethiopian Bible has been hidden for centuries. It's time we finally brought it into the light.